needs to change. The shape of our economy after Brexit will not only be determined by the text negotiated in Brussels, it will be driven by political decisions about the direction we wish to take for this country. We could try to carry on as before with economic thinking that has fueled instability, insecurity, and brought about crisis. Or we can embrace change and build a more equal and more prosperous society that meets people's hopes and needs. So today, I not only want to talk about getting a good deal with the EU, but about getting a good deal for all of our country's people. You may be working for a big company, struggling with increasing personal debt, striving to meet excessive rent or mortgage payments. You may alternatively be running a small business, scraping by week to week, awaiting payments to come in to cover ever-rising overheads. You may be employed in the public sector, having barely seen a pay rise in 10 years, but working harder than ever as many of your colleagues have lost their jobs and you're covering for them. Or you may be surviving in the precarious economy as 1 in every 9 working people now are, maybe getting paid the minimum wage on a 0-hours contract, instantly sackable, never knowing for sure whether you'll have work from one day to the next. When people such as these think about the economy, of course they're asking, what's in it for me? Household debt is rising, rent rising, utility bills rising, while the public services we all rely on are shrinking in terms of what they can provide. Social care, the National Health Service, and all of our children's education. Last week, and it was almost unnoticed amid the drama of cabinet resignations, Professor Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, published a damning report on poverty in the UK. He found that a fifth of the population, amounting to 14 million people, are living in poverty. He catalogued what he described as the dramatic decline in the fortunes of the least well-off, and said our rates of child poverty, and I quote, are not just a disgrace, but a social calamity and an economic disaster. The fact is that wealth hasn't trickled down. Instead, rigid and outdated economic thinking has helped create a situation where 20% of Britain's wealth is in the hands of just 1% of the population, making us one of the most unequal countries in the European Union. Inflated boardroom bonuses haven't made our economy stronger or more successful. Corporation tax cuts haven't increased investment and growth or put more money into pay packets. And financial deregulation didn't deliver self-regulating markets, but an era-defining economic crash from which we are still struggling to recover. It could not be clearer. Business as usual is not working. And when the rules of the game aren't working for the overwhelming majority, the rules of the game need to change. That means a new settlement for business and a stronger say for the workforce, where government will drive a higher rate of investment in infrastructure, education, skills, and the technologies, the exciting new technologies of the future. And the largest businesses that can afford it will pay a little bit more towards the common good from which we will all benefit. So, we will repeal the 2016 Trade Union Act and roll out sectoral collective bargaining to ensure working people can be fairly represented through their unions. And at the Labour Party annual conference in September, we set out a proposal to give workers a say and a stake in larger businesses. We'll legislate to ensure 1/3 of the seats on company boards are reserved for elected worker directors, and we'll give employees a stake in company profits by asking big businesses to transfer shares to be held by workers in trust. Despite the frenzied reaction in certain sections of the press, there certainly isn't any kind of war on business. Actually, it's rather the opposite. We recognise the vast and vital contribution businesses make to our economy and our society. And at the heart of that contribution are your employees. They have an interest in the long-term success of your company because it's their company as well. They have that in-depth institutional knowledge of its day-to-day workings. They have so much to contribute, and giving them a real voice will actually strengthen, not weaken, business. Workers create profits. Giving workers a share in them isn't just fair, it's actually good for business. We believe our plans are necessary, not just to create a fairer economy that can command public legitimacy, but to rebuild our economy for the 21st century and raise productivity and investment in every region, nation, and community, particularly those communities that feel so left behind in many parts of Britain. We share an understanding of the urgent need to increase public investment in the economy. And if the public is going to invest on the scale needed, then people need to feel they have a real say over their own economic future. The UK is the only major economy where investment is falling, not rising. That's holding back our economy, our innovation, and actually our productivity. The failure to invest means Britain's productivity is 15% lower than that of other major economies. So a future Labour government will develop a comprehensive industrial strategy to rebalance our economy, reduce our reliance on the financial sector centred in London and the South East, and increase prosperity in every region and nation of the UK. We'll follow the example of Germany and Canada in establishing a national investment bank and a network of regional development banks. These will provide $250 billion of private lending capital to emerging businesses and cooperatives across the country, getting the money to where it is needed and filling the gaps in lending that have been left by private banks. But as well as the lending gap, we're also determined to close the skills gap. We will create a national education service to provide both vocational and academic training to anyone who wants it throughout their life. It's the best way to ensure people are equipped with the skills they need to flourish. Because education doesn't just benefit the individual who receives it. It benefits the economy, it benefits the whole society, it benefits all of us. We recognise that to close the skills gap, we cannot close ourselves off from the rest of the world. So when others, Tories, talk about high-skilled immigration, what they actually mean is high-wage immigration. That won't solve the shortage of nurses, care workers and builders who desperately need and are vital to rebuilding an economy that works for all. Many sectors, agriculture and others, are very, very concerned about what is happening to them in the future. There is nothing to gain from false competition between good and bad migration, which only whips up division and hatred. Having seen the consequence of this government's hostile environment with the Windrush scandal, few will be convinced that this government is capable of delivering either a fair or efficient migration system. Britain's infrastructure, roads, railways, telecommunications, desperately need upgrade, which is why Labour is also planning to create a national transformation fund. This will provide a further $250 billion, making sure we have the infrastructure we need to achieve our potential. We've been talking a lot today about the urgency and importance of choices we face over Brexit. But in a very real sense, the most serious and pressing challenge we face of all, for all of us, is the potential decimation of our planet. That's why, in response to many reports over many years and the recent IPCC report, our policy to aim for 60% of heat and electricity to come from low-carbon or renewable sources by 2030 and to achieve net zero emission before 2050 is, I think, the right one. The Conservative government has overseen a 56% fall in investment in renewable energy over the last year. Our government will put environment centre stage. That doesn't have to mean sacrifice. It's actually a huge opportunity for businesses, jobs and communities. We will create 400,000 high-skilled, well-paid green jobs, cutting emissions and generating employment at the same time by increasing the production of offshore wind power sevenfold, doubling onshore wind power, trebling solar power and launching a £12 billion fund for home insulation. These are, I concede, bold plans, but they are necessary if we're to meet the climate crisis head-on, which will not spare any of us, it will affect every single one of us, and upgrade our economy at the same time for the 21st century. To tackle the greatest challenges facing our country today, we shouldn't fear change, we should embrace it. Deep-seated change is needed to avoid a damaging Brexit that will hurt enterprise, jobs and living standards, and instead use it as a catalyst for economic transformation. Change is needed to prevent the destruction of our environment that endangers all of our futures and all of our children's futures. And change is needed to tackle the huge inequality that has distorted the economy and in so many ways fractured our society. A senior figure in public life recently warned, an economy in which the returns to capital are greater than the returns to labour is one in which support for capitalism is going to decline. No, that's not a quote from John McDonnell or anybody else in the shadow cabinet. They're the words of former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne. And he was absolutely right. Businesses in Britain today face a great future if they embrace the changes we need for our economy and our society. We're ready to lead that change, and I invite you to join us to make that change together, to rebuild our economy for our country, so it really does work for the many, really does work for everybody, not just for a few people. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be present with you.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Corbyn. Now, Jeremy's kindly agreed to take some questions. I think we've only got time for 6 questions, and we're going to take them in 2 sets of 3. So could I have the first questions, please? I'm looking for paddles. There's one up here, paddle number 3, and paddle number 4, and where's another one? And paddle number 1. So can we have sort of 4 and 3, 3 and 4 and 1, please, first?
Yes, Lewis Goodall, Sky News. Mr. Corbyn, you talk about the dangers of uncertainty, but I'm sure many of the business people in this room fear most the uncertainty that, of course, would be engendered and caused by a no-deal Brexit. So can you just say exactly why it is that the risk of even getting your deal, which might, some people here in an ideal world, be preferable, find preferable, why the risks of that no deal are worth getting your deal? And secondly, you just talk also about the idea of another referendum perhaps being on the table. If Labour were to come to power as a result of an election, would the idea of extending Article 50, even by a few months, say, also be on the table so you can negotiate the deal that you want?
Okay. And the next one, please.
Thank you. My name is Elif. I represent the 5 million young people who are currently using Barclays Life Skills. I wanted to know, as a young person, there's been a lot of negative talk about Brexit today, and I kind of want words of comfort. I wanted to know how you can personally ensure that young people will still have opportunities and hopefulness in such an uncertain future.
Yeah. Thank you. And finally, there was one over here, number 1.
Hi, Dermot Stern from DSL. We're consultants to the automotive sector. Last week, the Prime Minister said there were now 3 potential outcomes. No deal, her deal, or no Brexit, i.e. remaining. I'm just conscious the theme of our conference this year is the next generation. And we know the next generation, young voters, strongly wanted to remain. So I just wondered, Jeremy, do you have any message specifically for those next generation young voters?
Okay, thanks very much for your questions. On the first one, it came from Sky News, our friends at Sky News. I think the prospect of no deal would be really, really serious. If there's no deal, what then happens? Do we crash out? Do we then go into WTO rules? What then happens to all of the regulatory environment, all the trading relationships, and, of course, the tariffs we may or may not have to pay? I just think it would be an appalling vista. I do not believe anybody actually wants that. We would obviously make sure by as far as we can in Parliament. That simply didn't happen. But it does mean that the government has to be quite serious about bringing this proposal to Parliament, either in its current form. As I understand it, there is still some possibility that it may be changed a bit on the way there. But we have many objections to the deal that's been put up. It doesn't pass anywhere near the 6 tests that we put forward. And so our votes in Parliament will be to attempt to stop this deal and say to the government, you've got to go back and negotiate something else. There is time to do it. And by the way, when the EU says there isn't time, the EU has a long history of 11th hour negotiations. Even the Lisbon Treaty was renegotiated several times. Alif, your question on behalf of young people, I actually absolutely relate to and fully understand. If you look at the voting patterns in the referendum, there was huge votes to remain in London and the central areas of most of our big cities, and there were huge votes to leave in other parts of the country that were post-industrial for many people in them, and the economic opportunities are quite limited. Never underestimate the sense of anger in those communities in the way, ever since the decline of heavy engineering industries from the 1980s onwards, they've seen very little by the way of investment. And they've also seen now 8 years of austerity and cuts in local government expenditure. But also understand, as I hope I do, that young people living in big cities in London want to feel part of the rest of the world. They want that freedom to travel. They want that interaction with people from all over the world. The joy of metropolitan living is something that is very strong to many people. And so I would want to absolutely ensure that we maintain that close relationship with Europe, that our students have the chance to study at universities in Europe and indeed around the world. And I think the life-enhancing experience of doing a year of a 3-year degree at a university in another country is actually a very good one. And I would absolutely want to maintain membership of the Erasmus scheme to ensure that happens. And so I have spent a lot of time over the past 3 years travelling in Europe and meeting political leaders from all countries all over Europe. And so we would ensure there is that close relationship, understanding at the same time the anger that people felt when they voted to leave the EU in the first place. I campaigned to remain in the EU, but I also campaigned to reform the EU in a number of ways. The other question that was raised about the leave or no leave options. Well, if this government collapses and we have a general election, then we will obviously fight the general election on the kind of investment-led society that we would want to live in and the relationship we'd have with the rest of the world. Our party conference discussed this at some length, and everyone predicted the party conference would split apart. It didn't, absolutely not. It came together around a comprehensive position, which is the one that I've outlined on the trade relationship and the customs union, a permanent customs union with the European Union, and that we would leave all the options on the table. I lead a party, but I'm not a dictator to that party, but I've made it very clear those options are on the table. I don't want our country to be cut off from the rest of the world. I want our country to be an open, welcoming place that does relate to the rest of the world. And I think that's what the vast majority of young people across this country want. And so I think what we've put forward actually does unite people, does bring people together, and does give real hope for the future. And the chair is hovering, so he wants me to stop so he can take 3 more questions.
Thank you. Right, can we have 3 crisp questions, please, so that we make use of our remaining time? We've got number 3 again, number 2, and can we have one on the other side? Number 4 again, I guess. Yeah, that's it. And so please keep the questions crisp and to the point so that Jeremy's got a chance to answer them. Thank you.
Jenny Gray, ITV News. You've outlined your plan, Mr Corbyn, to negotiate a Labour Brexit deal with the EU to replace what you describe as Theresa May's blindfold Brexit. Why would your proposed deal be any easier to negotiate with the EU in terms of getting a better deal than Theresa May's deal?
Okay.
Hi, Stuart Macer, Strategic Narrative. Mr Corbyn, what's your view of people personally doing well financially from businesses they start, found, grow or lead?
Where was the final question? Somewhere. Over here, number 2, please.
Laura Cohen, Chief Executive of the British Ceramic Confederation, a trade association for ceramic manufacturers across the UK. With 130 days to Brexit, what practically, how can you get the concrete measures you are proposing agreed in time to avoid the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit that would be so damaging for UK businesses and UK jobs and UK investment?
Thanks. First of all, Greg from ITV News, thanks for your question. The difference between us and the Conservatives are that we would not be approaching negotiations with the EU on the basis of a series of threats to the EU. We're not looking to turn this country into some kind of Singapore-style tax haven on the shores of Europe. What we want is, as I've outlined, the kind of high investment, high productivity society that I think pretty well everybody in this room would certainly want to go to as well. What we've had is the Trade Secretary going around the world announcing that he was going to negotiate 40 trade deals and it would be easy to do. I haven't heard of one that's been agreed, even in any kind of outline form with anybody. The world simply isn't like that. About half of our trade is with the EU, and I think we should be looking to protect those jobs and those trade arrangements, and also, by giving some degree of certainty, make sure that the investment decisions that are so important for the future are still made to keep those manufacturing jobs in this country. So I believe the approach would be very, very different as well. Stuart, your question about people doing well is sort of on the philosophical end of the event today, and I like that. No, I don't have a problem with people doing well at all. Indeed, I work with and know many people in my own community and other places that do set up and establish small businesses, and sometimes they grow to be considerably bigger. They all go through the pain of trying to get a premises, if they're making things or selling things, trying to borrow the money to do it, trying to fix it up and all that to get started. And they work incredibly hard, and they do take huge personal risks to achieve it. Some fall by the wayside and those businesses don't make it. Others do very well. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem at all with that. Quite the opposite. It's actually the dynamic that's brought about much of the technical and economic development we've got in this country. But two things need to happen. One is those innovative, creative people that have designed so much of the high technology we've got need support to do it and need access to appropriate funding to get their businesses going. And if they do become incredibly rich, then I invite them to be happy with their wealth, but also to share it a bit by paying their taxes as appropriately so that our public services are there for them just as much as they're there for everybody else, so that we don't have this horribly divided society. I don't think any of us want to walk past rough sleepers on the way into our businesses every day. What we want to do is walk into our businesses knowing that we have a society that does care for the very vulnerable and those that have suffered all kinds of catastrophes in their lives. That makes for a happy society. Many, I'm sure, in this room give and support charities in lots of ways and give lots to their community, and I thank businesses for that. But it's also important that we do have properly funded public services to make sure those services are there for all time. Laura, your question about the urgency of it from the Ceramics Federation. First of all, well done on the Ceramics Federation for the innovation, the work that you do, and the high-quality products you produce that have changed to some extent from the mass production of the 18th, 19th, 20th century into the very high-quality, fantastic stuff you produce at the moment and the growth of that industry. You're right, there is 130 days to go. You're right, there has to be a sense of urgency about it. That's why I say to the government and the Prime Minister, the deal you've offered is clearly not acceptable. You must be able to see that. You must have done the sums in Parliament. And all the measurements of public opinion indicate it's not acceptable either. So recognise that and go back and negotiate something that I believe can bring people together, which is where I suggested. So instead of this idea that we remove ourselves from any decision-making for several years and then the EU can decide where and when we are not part of that any longer. Instead, negotiate the principle of a customs union, a permanent customs union with the EU, so we'll have that stability of knowing where our trade and our markets are, and that stability of that relationship with what is, after all, a very important trading partner for us. And I finish on this point. I'll try and understand why people voted in the different directions they did in 2016 and put forward proposals that bring people together, that put forward economic and social proposals that bring our society together. And when societies are brought together, they're much, much stronger. They're weakened by division, weakened by poverty, and weakened by a lack of investment. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to your conference.
Thank you very much. We could have had a much longer question session. Next year we'll put you on a bit earlier if you're willing to do it. We'll give you 3 hours of questions. Thanks a lot. Okay, well look, I think that was... Please join me in thanking Jeremy Corbyn, the Leader of the Opposition, for taking the time to be with us today and sharing his vision. I think we should give him a clap on the way out. And that almost brings the day to a close. So at this point, I'd like to invite Carolyn to join me again on the stage for just a few closing remarks. Carolyn.